To understand compression, we need to understand the idea of dynamics. Dynamics is a term used to describe changes in volume of an audio signal over time. So if a sound has a lot of variance between loud and quiet parts, then we say it has high dynamic range. So if you imagine a vocalist singing, for example, sometimes they might sing really loud at the top of their voice, and then a few moments later bring their volume down to a near whisper. So sounds like vocals with high dynamic range can be problematic in music production because if you try and turn the sound up in order to hear the quiet parts, then the loudest parts become too loud. And likewise, if you then try and turn the sound back down in order to reduce the louder parts, then suddenly the quietest parts are now really quiet and you can't hear them anymore. So when you compress audio, you're compressing dynamic range, bringing the louder parts and the quieter parts closer together, resulting in a sound that's much more even and easier to control. And the most common form of compression, which is the way that most compressors work, is called downward compression, which works by using gain reduction to turn the loudest parts of the signal down, making the overall sound more even, and then turning the whole volume back up again in order to get the sound back to its original volume. So that's a basic overview of what a compressor does. So now let's talk about the basic controls. The threshold is one of the most important parameters in a compressor, and what it does is determines what input volume will be enough for the compressor to start acting. So in downward compression, if the sound registers below the threshold, then the compressor ignores it and does nothing. But if it detects sound exceeding the threshold, that will trigger the compressor to start using gain reduction to turn down and compress the sound. So as you can see from this graphic here, only the parts of the waveform above the threshold was enough to trigger gain reduction, and everything else below it, the compressor did nothing to. The ratio can be thought of almost like the strength of the compressor. While the threshold determines when the compressor should start acting, the ratio determines how strong the compression should be, and it works as a ratio of decibels, or dB. So if we use a ratio of 4:1 as an example, this means that for every 4 dB the input exceeds the threshold by, the result will be compressed so it only exceeds it by 1 dB. And this would require the compressor applying a gain reduction of -3 dB. So keeping the ratio of 4:1, if we now adjust the threshold down so that the signal exceeds the threshold by +8 dB, with the same 4:1 ratio, the resulting signal should be +2 dB above the threshold, with a gain reduction applied by the compressor in this case of -6 dB. And so just to illustrate this point further, you'll see that if we adjust the ratio from 4:1 to 8:1, you can see now that this stronger ratio means the compressor is applying more gain reduction to the waveform, and the result is now 1 dB above the threshold. And finally, if we now adjust the ratio to be a much weaker 2:1, you can see that now the gain reduction applied is -4 dB, and the result is 4 dB above the threshold compared to the original 8, since the ratio of 8:4 is the same as 2:1. Since downward compression works by turning the loudest parts of a signal down, this means that the result is quieter than it was before, since all the loudest parts have been turned down. Makeup gain is therefore used to compensate and turn the sound back up to its original level, so that the processed signal isn't much quieter than the original signal. This is a technique called gain staging, and it is essential to use whenever you apply a processor to an audio signal. So those are the most common basic controls that you find in pretty much every compressor, and you can often get the result you need by only using these 3 controls. Most compressors, however, will have extra controls that allow you to fine-tune the compressor's behavior a little bit and get closer to the kind of sound that you're looking for. The knee basically controls how sharp the compressor's threshold is. If you have a hard knee, this means that when the input exceeds the threshold, it will immediately start compressing at its full ratio. So just to illustrate this point, if you look at this graphic here, the ratio in this case has been set to 30:1, which is a very strong ratio. And just watch what happens to the gain reduction and the ratio when the input exceeds the threshold. So as you saw in the graphic there, as soon as the input went past the threshold, the compressor started applying gain reduction immediately at the set ratio of 30:1. So that was an example of what happens with a hard knee, but now we'll bring the input back down again, and now we're going to give the compressor a soft knee, which, as you can see from this graphic, a soft knee is kind of like feathering or smoothing out the threshold a bit. So we're going to increase the input again, this time with a soft knee, and now watch how the gain reduction and ratio behave differently compared to how they did with the hard knee. So just to pause the graphic here and have a look at what's going on, you can see that the input hasn't actually hit the original threshold yet, but there is a very small amount of gain reduction being applied. And you can see that the ratio that it's applying to the input is not the full ratio that was originally set, but rather a reduced version of it. So let's continue to run the graphic now and keep an eye on what happens with the gain reduction and the ratio as the signal passes the threshold. So as you can see, as the input started to go further above the threshold, the ratio eventually went up to its maximum strength, so the gain reduction was being applied to the input at the set ratio. So that was a soft knee, which usually makes the compressor smoother and more transparent. The attack time determines how quickly the compressor applies gain reduction when the input is increased. So if you look at this graphic where we have the attack time set at 0 milliseconds, and now watch what happens to the gain reduction when the input is increased. So as you just saw there, as the input was increasing, the gain reduction was being applied instantly without any kind of delay or smoothness applied to the gain reduction. So now let's change the attack time to something like 100 milliseconds, and now let's watch and see how the gain reduction reacts to increases in input with this new attack time. So as you can see there, even though we had a very fast transient increase in input volume, the gain reduction wasn't applied instantly, but rather smoothly over a set period of time. The release time is similar to the attack time in that it controls how responsive the compressor is, except that it determines how quickly the compressor goes back to a neutral state when the input is reduced. So if we have a look at this graphic again, with the release time set at 0 milliseconds, and now watch how the gain reduction reacts when the input volume is reduced. So as you saw there, once again, when the input volume was reduced, the gain reduction immediately went back to a neutral position without any kind of delay or smooth ramp. So again, we're going to change the release time now to something slower like 500 milliseconds. And now let's watch again and see how the gain reduction reacts to decreases in input volume with this new release time. So again, as you saw there, even though there was a sudden dip in the input volume, the gain reduction kept being applied and then slowly went back to its neutral state over a set period of time. So it's worth bearing in mind that the attack time comes into play with increases in input and gain reduction, and the release time comes into effect with decreases. And it doesn't matter how close the input is to the threshold, the attack and release time both come into play with these two opposing motions. So just to give a very basic explanation of how I usually use compression, without going into too much detail, I usually start by adjusting the ratio to wherever I think it needs to be, whether that be a very weak, not too strong ratio, or something stronger, and then basically just reduce the threshold down starting at 0 until you start to see the gain reduction needle taking off however much dB you need. And this can vary depending upon what you're trying to do or the sound you're compressing. But in general, if you see more than 10 dB or so gain reduction being applied, then this is usually too much. And personally, I rarely have gain reduction of any more than -5 dB. And then once I've set my compression, I'll just use the makeup gain to bring the volume back to its original level and just turn the plugin on and off to make sure that it's the same loudness. And the knee attack and release can also be adjusted for different styles and effects, but I won't go into too much detail about these parameters today. So hopefully you found this video useful in understanding compression better. If you have any questions, then feel free to leave it in the comments. Or if you have any requests for what you'd like to see a video about, please let me know. And if you like the video, please like and subscribe. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.